Okay, today we've got two teaching assistants, Chick, who you've met before, and this back here is Small Fry, Chick's slightly smaller sister. Say hello, girls. Yes, you are correct. These rabbits are bigger than cats. So today we're going to move on to our third component of evidence-based practice, worker and organizational experiences. We've discussed some of these briefly before, but we'll go into them in more detail this week. So the first thing that you'll remember is social work practice is filled with a lot of extraneous factors that will impact our decision making because we just get a lot of information thrown at us. Some of it is good, right? Like the resources we have available, training. Some of it not so good, like our experiences with vicarious trauma, organizational trauma, if a critical incident has occurred at your agency, such as the death of a child. And then there's also other things that you might not have a lot of control over, like the team dynamics, how you and your coworkers work together, the organizational climate of the agency. And then some things come with time, like years of experience, worker stress, your attitudes, and your feeling of self-efficacy. So how confident are you that you're able to do your job? So some of these things, as you can see, are related to a particular case, such as the family dynamics and the family strengths and caregiver risk factors, but a lot of it is external to that. And that's where Bowman came up with the practice and decision-making ecology. So basically what this theory states is that the decision we make based on an assessment is going to be different based on the characteristics around us and within us as social workers. And what he found within child protection in particular is that more experienced workers, so social workers with 15 years or more of experience, will make less conservative decisions than social workers with only 2 years of experience. So a social worker with 15 or more years of experience will be less likely to remove a child from a home than a social worker with only 2 years of experience who might judge the situation a lot more conservatively and err on the side of caution because they don't have that experience to lean back on. A good example of this is how experienced workers versus new workers respond to something like marijuana in the home. Back when marijuana was illegal, there were several cases where less experienced workers were liable to remove a child from the home if it was found that the parents were growing pot because it was judged that that was a significant risk factor because it would attract an undesirable element to the home and make it more likely that the child would be injured. On the other hand, the social workers with more than 15 years of experience knew that that was not likely going to be the case, and having a pot plant or two in the home was not going to have the same kind of impact on the child as was feared by the younger workers, especially if there was no other risk factors for the caregivers. So the important thing for you is to help you narrow down your decision so that it removes some of these noisy aspects and focuses on the things that you actually really need to pay attention to. So the evidence-based practice is not going to do that for you. You're going to have to put in the hard work to make sure that your attitude and your exposure to media and how it influences your actions within your practice are accounted for. And to do that, you really need to engage in mindful practice, and you do that by recognizing that how you make decisions and how you think about everyday things is impacted by heuristics and cognitive biases. So we've mentioned these briefly before, but basically heuristics are mental shortcuts that are used to simplify complex decision making. So, for instance, if I tell you that I have a pet rabbit, you instantly think of, oh, a cute little brown fuzzy thing. You don't have to spend very long trying to remember what does a rabbit look like. A mental image instantly pops up, and then you move on to the next thought. However, the problem occurs when our heuristics become biases. So the tendency to make a decision or practice based on individual perceptions rather than evidence. So when we start relying on our heuristics too much and ignore what is actually happening. So how these heuristics and cognitive biases can help us make decisions more quickly, and we tend to use them when there's time pressures and deadlines. They are less helpful when it comes to complex social issues or looking at our organizational context, because they really increase the likelihood that we're going to make an error. So the more pressure there is to make a decision quickly, the more you really have to pause and make sure, are you actually considering all the factors, or are you just depending on biases in your individual perception instead? So you have to consider and look at the cause. Right, sorry about that. Okay, so we need to check our cognitive biases, and that means knowing what some of them are. And one common one is the propensity to seek causation between events. So our brains do this automatically. They see a series of random events and they think that there's actually a pattern there, that something is causing all of these random events. Like a good example is when you're walking down the street at night and random street lights turn off due to mechanical failure or whatever, but you start thinking that every time you walk under a street light, it's going to turn off. And you just start paying attention more to streetlights turning off. It's not that, you really are causing the streetlights to turn off. You don't have those kind of magical powers. It's just you're paying attention to it more, so you're creating a pattern of these random events. And we do the same thing with our social work practice as well. When we see our clients do things, we might consider that there is a cause and effect between what our client's behavior is and things we've seen before in the past, but that's not necessarily the case. And that's also connected to what's known as the availability heuristic. So that's the process of judging frequency of an event by the ease with which it comes to mind. And we see this a lot when it comes to the news media, for instance. If you're working in child protection, you're going to start paying a lot of attention to child deaths in the media, and you tend to ignore other types of news because now this is the one that's most relevant to you. So you're going to think that child deaths are happening a lot more frequently than they really are, because that's what you're paying attention to, and that's what's most frequently on your mind. It's similar to how most people think that acts of terrorism are extremely common because they're so frequently in the news all the time, when really you're much more likely to be a victim of a car crash than an act of terrorism. And all of this impacts how we assess risk. So the more an emotional reaction we have to something, the more we're gonna judge the situation as risky, and we're not necessarily going to be able to tell that the reason we're judging a situation to be more risky is because we have that emotional reaction to it. So for instance, if you have personally experienced something that now your client is going through, you might judge it in a different way compared to somebody who doesn't have that prior experience and is having that emotional reaction in response to the client's story. So you really need to pay attention to those emotions that might be going on behind the scenes. Next is the fundamental attribution error. So with this one, we tend to overestimate the influence of attitudes and personality on behavior, and we underestimate the power of a situation. So while we're making a decision, can be very difficult to ascertain in the moment, but we always need to be very aware of the context within which that decision is occurring to make sure that it's not impacting how we're making that decision. And I mentioned time pressures, for instance, that can really sway how we make a decision, regardless of what our attitudes or prior training might be telling us. And another issue, which we tend to see a lot with new workers, is overconfidence. When you have excessive confidence in your understanding of a situation, you tend to make the wrong decision because you're not aware of your lack of knowledge. So that self-efficacy that I talked about, the belief in your ability to do your job, it does have a drawback for new workers. If they are too overconfident in their skills and abilities, they don't recognize their own lack of knowledge and gaps in their own skill set, which can be very bad because then you're not assessing the situation correctly. You're missing out key components, but you're not even recognizing that you're missing key things because you're just so confident in the decision you've made. You're not leaving any room for doubt. And doubt is actually a very good thing when it comes to addressing our cognitive biases, because it makes us second guess things, ensuring that we're not just going with the first thought that comes to our mind, that we are taking the time to check multiple perspectives, consider multiple hypotheses before we reach a decision and settle on a course of action. And this is especially important when it comes to things like confirmation bias. With confirmation bias, we tend to identify and interpret existing information in ways that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. So we're also more likely to pay attention to information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs and to ignore information that contradicts it. So you have to be very careful that you are allowing for multiple sources of information, which is often contradictory in social work practice, and being comfortable with that discomfort of having contradictory information, because it's just the practice that we have, and we need to be able to respond to complex situations where things don't always make a lot of sense at first glance. And all of this is impacted by the privilege and the implicit biases that we have. So I want you to watch 2 short YouTube videos on first privilege and then implicit bias, and consider how you are impacted by privilege and how your decision making is impacted by privilege, and how you as a social worker can consistently and effectively address your biases and your privileges.